Okay, hi everybody. My name is James Buchanan. I'm a health economist working at the University of Oxford. I'd like to start by thanking the meeting organisers for the opportunity to contribute to this session on sustainability. As per my title, my aim is to provide a health economics perspective on the translation of genome and exome sequencing into clinical practice in Africa. And this process is, of course, going to be challenging, and it will need to be supported by a high quality Africa-specific scientific and clinical evidence base. And a crucial component of this translational evidence base is data on the health economics of sequencing in an African context, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Before I do that, I'm going to briefly talk about health economics more generally, as I'm aware that this is, there's a very multidisciplinary audience here today. Some of you may not work with health economists all that frequently, if at all. So what is health economics? Well, here's a standard definition. Health economics is the study of how scarce resources are allocated among alternative uses for the care of sickness and the promotion, maintenance and improvement of health. Now, health economists do a lot of different things, but possibly the most relevant activity to mention in the context of this presentation is that many health economists spend a lot of time carrying out economic evaluations. So these are studies in which we compare the costs and the outcomes, or the health effects of different healthcare interventions. And the results of these analyses provide evidence of the value of new healthcare interventions. And these could be new treatments or new surgical procedures, or importantly, for us here today, this could be new genomic tests. Health economists around the world conduct economic evaluations across all clinical areas and interventions. And there's a growing community of health economists working on understanding where genomic testing holds value. And if you want to find these health economists, or you want to learn more about work in this area, then there are a few places that you can look. So in no particular order, there's a well-established working group on global economics and evaluation of clinical genomic sequencing, which publishes standalone papers and journal special issues on this topic. So as an example, here's a recent publication in BMJ Global Health on the availability and funding of clinical genomic sequencing globally. Here's a recent special issue of Value in Health, focusing on assessing the value of next generation sequencing technologies. There are also groupings of health economists working in genomics in all the major international health economics organisations. This is one such special interest group, which is part of the International Health Economics Association. And finally, I have a blog that might be a good starting point as well, where I publish weekly publication alerts. So although there's an active health economics and genomics community, this community has only really developed relatively recently. So although the health economic evidence base is growing on this topic, it's still relatively thin when it comes to genome and exome sequencing. So what I've shown you on screen here is the most recent review of the cost effectiveness of genome and exome sequencing from 2018. So this review identified only 8 economic evaluations of any form of sequencing, mostly in the context of rare diseases, and no health economic evidence on the use of sequencing in Africa. Now, given the limited nature of these studies, this review concluded that the current health economic evidence base to support the more widespread use of these tests in clinical practice is very limited. Now, there have been a few economic evaluations published since 2018, but this conclusion still largely stands. Fortunately, I think the prospects of better quality evidence on the health economics of sequencing are good going forward. One driving force behind improvements in the evidence base is that many of the larger national sequencing initiatives in high-income countries are starting to reach maturity. And in some cases, we're seeing sequencing move from research into clinical practice. In England, the NHS Genomic Medicine Service was launched last year on the back of the successful completion of the Genomics England 100,000 Genomes project. And health economics work has been undertaken alongside the 100,000 Genomes project. And the first results from this work should be published, hopefully, in the next couple of months. Now, one of the exciting things we can do with the big data sets generated in these projects is explore in great detail the cost of the diagnostic odyssey. And following on from this, the potential for sequencing to save huge amounts of money and improve the health of both patients and their families. So here is just one example from the 100,000 Genomes project. This is a 10-year-old girl. She was admitted to intensive care with life-threatening chickenpox. She underwent a diagnostic odyssey that lasted 7 years, spanned multiple clinical specialties. She experienced 307 episodes of secondary care, and these cost about $500,000. Following genome sequencing, she was diagnosed with a CTPS1 deficiency, which meant she could have a curative bone marrow transplant, and also meant that her siblings could undergo predictive testing as well, and it indicated that no further family members were at risk. So the costs and the health benefits of conducting sequencing as a first-line test are hopefully pretty apparent in this example. So that's just a quick overview of the current health economics evidence base for sequencing. I think it's worthwhile to pause at this point and ask why a high-quality health economics evidence base for sequencing is so important. And that's both in general and also in particular in an African context. And first and foremost, I think sequencing is obviously expensive. In the larger national sequencing initiatives, there's a suggestion that a single patient can be sequenced for about $700. But in reality, if you sequence a rare disease trio or a pair of cancer samples, and you do this in a single centre, and you add on the costs of bioinformatics and data storage, the true cost of sequencing is much higher, and probably closer to $10,000 than $700. Now, this is expensive in any context, but it's particularly expensive in resource-constrained settings. Second point to mention is it's quite likely that sequencing can only be translated into clinical practice in a cost-effective manner if this is done as part of a national programme. So this means that sequencing isn't just expensive on a single test basis, but also at the system level. And again, this is problematic in resource-constrained settings. Third, a problem that all health economists are grappling with is how to measure the effects of sequencing. So many economic evaluations currently report the cost per additional diagnosis for sequencing versus clinical practice. And this isn't sufficient for many decision makers who make their decisions on which healthcare interventions to fund based on the impact of these interventions on quality of life and survival. Now, these issues are present in all settings. But they're possibly even more relevant in an African context because of the lack of research capacity in health economics and genomics, and also the fact that there are so many competing funding priorities, including treatments for infectious and chronic diseases that affect millions of people. So with this in mind, thinking specifically about the theme of sustainability and moving sequencing forward in Africa, if we were to aim to achieve this, what would a health economics research agenda look like that supported achieving this aim? Here are a few of my thoughts on the evidence that I think is required, but it would be great to open this up to a wider discussion. First, I think we definitely need evidence on the cost effectiveness of sequencing in Africa. Now, these economic evaluations need to go beyond number of diagnoses as an outcome measure, and they also need to consider the costs incurred by patients in primary and secondary care before and after testing. Second, I already mentioned the potentially high health system costs of implementing sequencing, and we also need Africa-specific budget impact analyses because of this. Third, we need data to be collected on the quality of life of patients and their families, and again, this needs to be collected both before and after sequencing. Fourth, it's important to understand which health and non-health outcomes of sequencing are most important for African populations, and there are health economics tools that can help with this as well. And then finally, I think a case needs to be made that sequencing makes sense from a national perspective. So what are the wider macroeconomic benefits of implementing sequencing in clinical practice? And I suspect this needs to be a key component in 3MAG going forwards. Now, generating this evidence will obviously be a challenge, of course, but this research agenda, I think, also represents a huge opportunity for health economists in Africa to contribute to the growing field of health economics and genomics, and to, at the same time, push forward an Africa-focused research agenda. I think African health economists are particularly well placed to address research questions that haven't really been tackled in the, in the higher income countries that have kind of dominated research in this field to date. So to give you some examples, what is the impact of genetic diversity on the costs and the health outcomes of sequencing? Are there some testing models that are more cost effective than others in an African context? So one could consider testing in the community versus hub testing, for example. Third, little attention has been paid to date on the cost effectiveness of different sequencing technologies. So is nanopore sequencing a cost effective option in Africa, for example? And then what about the cost effectiveness of screening for genetic variants that are rare in Western populations but more common in African populations? I think this is just a subset of all the really interesting research questions that African health economists are particularly well placed to tackle in this context. Okay, final slide. What should the next steps be in this translational journey from a health economist perspective? I think there are two big steps to focus on. First, a lot of the existing health economics work related to sequencing, and particularly that's been undertaken alongside national sequencing programs, has really been almost an afterthought. A lot of this work uses data sets that haven't been collected by health economists or for health economists, and this really limits the research questions that can be addressed in a robust manner. So I think if you only take 1 point away from my presentation, I'd hope it would be this. Really try to embed the collection of health economic data in all sequencing studies going forward, whether these are small local studies or larger national or international sequencing initiatives. And here again, I'm thinking in particular of 3MAG. I think prospectively collecting data in this way will make such a huge difference to the research that's possible in the future. And that's not just thinking about the global health economics and genomics community, but in particular making a difference for researchers and for research in Africa. And then the second thing I wanted to say on this slide is that, I mentioned there's a growing community of health economists working in genomics. And I know, most, if not all of these people are really keen to support the generation of evidence in an African context, and also to help to build local capacity in health economics on this topic. So if you think it would be helpful, please do consider engaging with this community on future projects. I think it could really help to move this work forwards. Okay, I'm going to stop there to leave a couple of minutes for questions. I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators in work on this topic, as well as my funders, and importantly, of course, the participants in the Genomics England 100,000 Genomes project. And I'm just going to end with this slide in case people are interested in exploring this topic further. I'm very happy to share these slides as well, if that will be helpful. Just drop me an email. Thank you very much.